Shattered windshield glass tastes exactly like copper and failure. That was my last thought as the steering wheel crushed my ribs, my lungs refusing the cold November rain. I didn't get a beautiful, cinematic flashback of my life. I just saw the empty oak benches in courtroom 3B. My parents skipped my sentencing to sit in an auditorium and clap for my sister's vocal solo. When my eyes snapped open, the wreckage was gone. The trial was tomorrow, and I was going to burn their world down. Lemon-scented industrial floor wax. To this day, the chemical tang of it makes my jaw clench. That was all I could smell as I sat at the defense table. My hands were flat against the scratched mahogany, the varnish peeling in the corner where anxious defendants before me had picked at it. My public defender, a sweaty man named Greg, whose cheap polyester suit smelled faintly of stale onions, and desperation kept clicking his ballpoint pen. Click-clack, click-clack. "Stand up, Audrey," Greg muttered, elbowing my ribs. I stood. My knees felt like they were made of damp sand. The judge, a man with tired eyes and a drooping jowl, shuffled a stack of papers. "On the charge of corporate embezzlement." The judge droned his voice, bouncing off the high, acoustic-tiled ceiling. "This court finds the defendant." I turned my head, just a fraction. I shouldn't have, but the human instinct for comfort is a pathetic, stubborn thing. I looked at the gallery. There were 4 rows of heavy wooden benches. They were empty, not a single soul. No mother clutching a tissue. No father looking stoic but supportive. Just a sleepy bailiff picking at his cuticles by the double doors. "Yeah, guilty." The gavel hit the sounding block, a sharp wooden crack that reverberated behind my eyes. I didn't hear the sentence. 50 hours of community service, 2 years probation, 6 months in minimum security. It didn't matter. The conviction itself was the death sentence. My acceptance to law school, the one I had worked 80-hour weeks to earn, evaporated into the sterile courtroom air. My career was dead before it started. I was 22, and my life was over, framed by my internship manager for a discrepancy of $40,000 I had never even touched. Greg patted my shoulder, a damp, heavy weight. "We'll appeal. Let's step outside." In the holding area, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a relentless mosquito-like hum. I fumbled for my phone. The screen was cracked across the top right corner. I opened my messages. Nothing. I dialed my mother's number. It rang 4 times before the automated voicemail kicked in. I dialed my father. Same result. Finally, I opened our family group chat. There, sandwiched between a picture of a golden retriever puppy and a grocery list, was a text from my mother sent at 8:45 a.m. "Audrey, we can't make it downtown today. Chloe got a call back for the Starlight Idol regional showcase. Her solo is at 2. We have to drive out to the stadium. Good luck with the plea thing. Love you." The plea thing. My lungs seized. I stared at the pixels until they blurred. My sister Chloe. 2 years younger, a theater major who communicated entirely in show tunes and passive aggression. She had a nice voice, sure, but this wasn't even the actual show. It was a regional callback, a glorified high school talent show in a rented stadium. I walked out of the courthouse. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, leaking a freezing, relentless rain. The damp cold soaked through my thin blouse, instantly plastering the cotton to my skin. I didn't care. I felt hollowed out. A carved pumpkin rotting on a porch. I got into my beaten-up Honda. The ignition whined before catching. I didn't cry. Crying requires energy, a belief that things should be different. I had nothing left. I just pressed my foot onto the accelerator. The windshield wipers squeaked, smearing the rain rather than clearing it. I reached the intersection of 5th and Elm. The light was green. I drove through. I never saw the delivery truck run the red light. There was just a deafening crunch of metal, the explosive pop of shattering glass, and the violent, terrifying sensation of weightlessness. Then the steering wheel crushed into my chest. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth, the smell of burning rubber, the wet asphalt. They didn't come. That was the last thought that echoed in the dark. They chose her talent show over my life. Then the dark splintered. I gasped. Air violently forced its way into my lungs so sharp and cold it burned. My eyes snapped open. I was staring at a popcorn ceiling. A water stain in the shape of a crooked heart sat right above my head. My bedroom. My childhood bedroom in my parents' house. I bolted upright, my hands flying to my chest. No blood. No crushed ribs. I wore an oversized faded band t-shirt. The bedsheets were tangled around my legs, smelling faintly of laundry detergent and old cotton. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. I grabbed it, my fingers trembling so badly, I dropped it onto the carpet. I snatched it up. November 14th, 7 a.m., tomorrow. The trial was tomorrow. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until I saw sparks. My heart was a frantic bird battering against my ribcage. I could feel the sweat cooling on the back of my neck. I wasn't dead. I was back. The universe had somehow hit a reset button, dragging me back 24 hours. Downstairs, I heard the faint, muffled sound of a piano scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Chloe, warming up her vocal cords. A low, vibrating hum started in my chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't joy. It was a cold, pure, unadulterated rage. It tasted like ash and adrenaline. I slowly lowered my hands. The tremor in my fingers was gone. The hardwood floor was cold against my bare feet as I walked down the hallway. The house smelled intensely normal. Coffee brewing, the sharp chemical sweetness of hairspray. I paused at the top of the stairs, gripping the oak banister. The wood felt impossibly solid. Real. I traced the grain with my thumb, grounding myself in the physical sensation. I am alive. It is the day before the trial. I descended the stairs quietly. The kitchen was a chaotic swirl of sequins, toll, and anxiety. Chloe stood in the center of the room wearing a sapphire blue dress that caught the morning light and threw fractured reflections across the cabinets. My mother, Beatrice, was on her knees, pinning a hem with a mouthful of silver needles. My father, Arthur, stood by the counter, aggressively steaming a velvet shawl with a handheld steamer. "Turn, sweetie, just a fraction," Beatrice mumbled around the pins. "You need to look flawless for the judges. This is regional television." Mom, it's pinching!" Chloe whined, her perfectly glossed lips twisting into a pout. She smelled of vanilla body spray, a cloying scent that made my stomach churn. "Beauty is pain, Chloe!" Arthur chimed in, holding the steamer up like a weapon. "You're going to blow them away! You're our star!" I stepped into the kitchen. My bare feet made a soft padding sound on the linoleum. Arthur noticed me first. He didn't smile. He just frowned at my faded t-shirt. "Audrey, you're up late. Grab a bagel, we're in the middle of a crisis here. The seam on the bodice is fighting your mother." I walked over to the toaster. My reflection in the stainless steel appliance looked pale, my eyes dark and hollow. In my previous life, I had come downstairs crying. I had begged them to focus. I had reminded them that my preliminary hearing was today, and the final trial was tomorrow morning. I had asked them to come with me to the lawyer's office to go over the defense strategy. They had told me I was being selfish. They had said the lawyer would handle it, that I was stressing Chloe out before her big day. I picked up a piece of cold leftover toast from a plate on the counter. It was burnt on the edges. I took a bite. The dry, carbonized bread scraped against the roof of my mouth. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. "Mom!" I said, my voice shockingly steady. It didn't crack. It didn't waver. "The trial starts tomorrow at 9 a.m. Beatrice froze a pin hovering inches from Chloe's shin. She sighed a long, exaggerated sound of exhaustion and looked up at me. Her hair was perfectly sprayed into submission. "Audrey, we've talked about this," Beatrice said, her tone dripping with rehearsed patience. "Greg is a professional. He knows what he's doing. Your sister has to be at the stadium by 10 for makeup and blocking. We can't be in two places at once." "It's a felony charge, Mom," I said flatly. "If I lose, I go to prison. My acceptance to law school is revoked." "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Arthur snapped, unplugging the steamer. "You just need to take the plea deal. It was a stupid mistake at work, Audrey. We all make them. Take the probation, pay the fine, and let's move on. We don't need this hanging over our heads while Chloe is trying to build a career." A stupid mistake. Liam, my manager at Horizon Tech, had funneled $40,000 into a dummy account using my login credentials while I was fetching his dry cleaning. He had a gambling problem. I had the ambition to be useful. I was the perfect fall guy. And my parents believed him. They believed the police over their own daughter because it was easier. It required less effort than fighting. "Right," I said. The single word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide and innocent, masking the cruel vanity beneath. "I'm sorry, Odds. I really wish I could be there. But you know how much this showcase means to me. It's my dream." "I know," I said. I swallowed the dry toast. It scratched my throat on the way down. "You should go to the show." The three of them blinked, clearly surprised by my lack of resistance. "No tears, no screaming match?" "Well," Beatrice said, spitting the pins into her palm. "That's very mature of you, Audrey. We'll take you out to dinner tomorrow night to celebrate. The plea deal, I mean, and Chloe's audition." "Dinner?" I repeated. "Sounds perfect." I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't look back. The moment I crossed the threshold into the hallway, the suffocating atmosphere of that house broke. I let out a long, slow breath. I wasn't going to take the plea. I wasn't going to wait for Greg to fumble my case. And I absolutely wasn't going to let Chloe have her perfect day in the sun while I sat in the dark. I had 24 hours. I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I threw open my closet doors. I bypassed the sad gray cardigan I had worn in my first life to look demure and repentant. Instead, I grabbed a sharp black blazer and a crisp white blouse. I was going to court, yes, but I wasn't going as a victim. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun. The pull on my scalp was a sharp reminder to stay focused. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and a worn leather notebook. As I walked past the kitchen window outside, I saw Arthur holding up the blue dress, Chloe twirling. They looked like a picture-perfect family from a detergent commercial. I slid into the driver's seat of my Honda. The steering wheel felt rough under my palms. A phantom ache throbbed in my chest, a memory of the crash that hadn't happened yet. I gripped the wheel tightly, letting the texture ground me. 24 hours. First stop, Horizon Tech. The morning air was biting, carrying the distinct smell of wet asphalt and approaching winter. I rolled the window down anyway, letting the wind whip against my face. I needed the shock of cold to keep my thoughts organized. In my previous life, I had relied entirely on Greg. I was 22, terrified, and believed in the justice system. I thought innocence was a shield. I thought the truth naturally floated to the surface. I was an idiot. Truth is a heavy stone. It sinks unless you drag it up yourself. The prosecution's entire case rested on two things: the IP logs showing the transfer was made from my workstation, and Liam's testimony that I had been acting suspiciously and asking questions about offshore accounts. Greg had failed to subpoena the building's internal security footage. When I asked him about it, he said Horizon Tech claimed the cameras in that hallway were down for maintenance. I knew they weren't. I had seen the little red recording light blinking every single day I walked past the server room. I parked 2 blocks away from the towering glass and steel structure of Horizon Tech. My stomach did a nervous flip, a remnant of the terrified intern I used to be. I ruthlessly shoved the feeling down. I walked into the lobby. The air conditioning was aggressive, smelling of ozone and expensive artificial pine. The polished marble floors clicked under my modest heels. I didn't go to the reception desk. I went straight to the loading dock entrance in the back. That's where Dave took his smoke breaks. Dave was a 50-something security guard with a bad knee and a worse nicotine habit. I used to bring him extra donuts from the morning meetings because no one else acknowledged he existed. I stepped out into the alley. The smell of garbage dumpsters and stale cigarette smoke hit me like a wall. Dave was leaning against the brickwork, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips. He blinked at me through the gray haze. "Audrey!" He said, his voice raspy. "Thought you were suspended. Or fired." "I am Dave," I said, stepping closer. I didn't smile. I didn't play the sweet intern. I looked him dead in the eye. "I need a favor. A big one." He shifted uncomfortably, dropping the cigarette and grinding it out with his heavy black boot. "I can't let you in the building, kid. You're on the ban list. My ass is on the line." "I don't want to go in," I said. "I need the footage from the 4th floor hallway. Specifically the camera facing my cubicle and Liam's office, for October 12th between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. Dave shook his head, looking away. "Can't do it. I T-wiped the main drives last week. Police order. And anyway, word came down from management that the cameras on 4 were broken that day." "They weren't broken, Dave, and you know it." I stepped closer, invading his personal space. I kept my voice low, a harsh whisper against the hum of the city traffic. "And I know you back up the raw feeds on a physical external drive in your booth before they hit the cloud server. You told me you do it because you don't trust the cloud." His eyes widened slightly. He had mentioned it once passingly, complaining about the company's tech upgrades. "I can't give you company property, Audrey. That's a crime." "Liam stealing 40 grand and framing me is a crime," I fired back. "If I go down tomorrow, Dave, I am dragging everyone into court. I will subpoena your personal logs. I will tell the defense exactly where you keep the unauthorized backups. You'll be fired, lose your pension, and get dragged into a federal investigation." It was a bluff. A massive, desperate bluff. I didn't have a lawyer competent enough to do any of that, but Dave didn't know that. He stared at me, evaluating. I kept my gaze locked on his, forcing my breathing to stay even. I could feel a bead of sweat tracing a line down my spine beneath the blazer. "Don't blink. Don't look away." Dave swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. "October 12th, 1 to 3. "Yes." He let out a long, rattling sigh. "Wait here." He turned and limped back inside. I leaned against the cold brick wall, my knees suddenly shaking violently. I pressed my hands flat against the rough stone, the sharp edges digging into my palms, grounding me. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The alley was quiet, save for the distant wail of a siren. I was terrified he had called the police. Finally, the heavy metal door clicked open. Dave slipped out. He didn't look at me. He just shoved a small black plastic USB drive into my hand. The plastic was warm from his pocket. It's just the raw MP4 file. He muttered. You didn't get it from me. If anyone asks, I've never seen you. Thank you, Dave. I said, my fingers closing tightly around the drive. The edges bit into my skin. It felt like a weapon. Just don't let that prick Liam get away with it, Dave said, turning his back to me. I walked away from the alley. By the time I reached my car, the shaking had stopped. I plugged my laptop into my car's cigarette lighter adapter and inserted the USB. My heart pounded in my ears, a heavy, rhythmic drumbeat. I opened the file. The grainy, soundless security footage appeared on the screen. Fast forward to 1:15 p.m. There I was leaving my desk, grabbing Liam's suits to run to the dry cleaners. Fast forward to 1:22 p.m. The door to Liam's office opened. He stepped out, looking left then right. The hallway was empty. He walked briskly to my workstation. He sat down. He typed furiously for exactly 4 minutes. Then he stood up, wiped the keyboard with his sleeve, and practically jogged back to his office. I hit pause. A slow, vicious smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It felt entirely foreign to my facial muscles. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. I closed the laptop. I had the match. Now I needed to fire the lawyer. I drove downtown to the public defender's office. It was a miserable gray concrete building that smelled permanently of bleach and despair. I found Greg in the chaotic bullpen, buried under a mountain of manila folders, a half-eaten donut resting dangerously close to his keyboard. "Audrey," he said, looking up clearly annoyed. "Your hearing isn't until tomorrow. We agreed you'd take the plea today at 3 p.m. I stood over his desk. I didn't sit in the stained plastic chair offered to clients. "I'm not taking the plea, Greg," I said. My voice was crisp, cutting through the murmurs of the bullpen. He groaned, rubbing his temples. "Audrey, listen to me. The DA is offering a sweet deal. Probation. You go to trial, you will lose. The evidence is entirely against you. I don't have the time to prep a lost cause for tomorrow." "You don't have to," I said. I reached into my bag and pulled out a form I had printed at the local library 30 minutes ago. I dropped it on top of his donut. "What's this?" He frowned, pulling the paper closer. "It's a motion to dismiss counsel," I stated smoothly. "I am firing you, Greg. I will be representing myself pro se tomorrow." Greg stared at me, his mouth slightly open, a crumb of powdered sugar clinging to his lower lip. "You're insane. A judge will eat you alive. You're a college student, not a lawyer." "I know enough," I said coldly. "And I care about my life, which is more than I can say for you. File the paperwork, Greg. I'll see you in court." I turned on my heel and walked out of the bullpen. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind me, sealing off the smell of bleach and failure. I stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. The sun had finally broken through the gray clouds, casting sharp, long shadows across the pavement. I took a deep breath. My parents were at the stadium right now, adjusting a blue dress and practicing fake smiles for television cameras. They thought I was currently crying in this building, signing my future away for a probation sentence. They had no idea what was coming. Tomorrow morning I wasn't just going to clear my name. I was going to dismantle the lies that built this trap. And then I had a talent show to attend. Courtroom 3. B felt colder than I remembered. Or maybe my body was just finally registering the shock of the last 24 hours. I sat alone at the defense table. The heavy mahogany surface was icy against my forearms. To my left, the jury box sat empty. This was a bench trial, a strategic mistake my former lawyer Greg had made, assuming a judge would be more lenient on a first-time offender taking a plea. I hadn't changed it. I preferred a judge. Juries could be swayed by a nice suit and a sob story. Judges only cared about paper. Judge Harrison, a woman with sharp, bird-like features and a terrifyingly neutral expression, peered down at me over her reading glasses. "Ms. Davis," she said, her voice dry as chalk dust, "I have your motion to dismiss counsel and proceed pro se. I am legally obligated to advise you that this is a spectacularly bad idea. You are facing a felony embezzlement charge. Do you understand the sheer gravity of this?" I do, Your Honor," I said. My voice wavered, just a fraction. A tiny pathetic crack on the word honor. I cleared my throat, digging my fingernails into my palms until a sharp pain grounded me. "I am prepared to represent myself." She stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the aggressive ticking of the wall clock. "Very well," Judge Harrison sighed, adjusting her robes. "Assistant District Attorney Miller, you may call your first witness." A DA Miller was a young, aggressively ambitious man who wore too much hair gel. He practically strutted to the podium. "The state calls Liam Gallagher, Your Honor." Liam walked through the swinging wooden doors. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. His leather shoes squeaked softly on the linoleum, squeak, 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 a rhythmic sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He didn't look at me. He took the stand, swore on the Bible with a practiced, solemn expression, and adjusted his tie. I watched his throat swallow. I smelled the faint waft of his designer sandalwood cologne from across the room. It made acid rise in the back of my throat. Miller led him through the setup. Liam played his part beautifully. He was the betrayed, deeply disappointed manager. He spoke of my potential and how he had mentored me, painting himself as a saint who had simply trusted the wrong intern. "Mr. Gallagher," Miller asked, leaning on the podium, "can you tell the court what happened on the afternoon of October 12th? Liam offered a sad, regretful sigh. "I was in meetings most of the afternoon. When I reviewed the quarterly transfer logs later that evening, I noticed $40,000 was missing from the Horizon Corporate Outreach Fund. IT traced the IP address. The transfer was executed directly from Audrey's workstation using her unique login credentials at exactly 1:24 p.m. And where were you at 1:24 p.m.? In the third-floor conference room, with the rest of the executive team. Liam lied effortlessly. Not a bead of sweat, not a twitch. Miller turned to me with a smug, tight-lipped smile. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Harrison looked down at me. "Ms. Davis, you may cross-examine the witness." I stood up. My knees felt like water. My cheap black blazer clung to my back with nervous sweat. I didn't have a podium. I just stood behind the scratched defense table. "Mr. Gallagher?" I started. My mouth was incredibly dry. I swallowed hard, forcing saliva down my throat. "You testified that on October 12th at 1:24 p.m., you were in the third-floor conference room. Is that correct?" Liam offered me a condescending smile. "That is correct, Audrey." "And you are absolutely certain of this timeline? You never left the conference room. You didn't, for example, go back to the fourth floor." "Objection!" Miller snapped, standing up. "Asked and answered. The defendant is badgering the witness." "Overruled." Judge Harrison said, her eyes narrowing slightly at me. "But get to the point, Ms. Davis." "I was in the conference room," Liam repeated, his tone sharpening. "The entire time." "Interesting," I said. I picked up the black plastic USB drive from the table. It felt heavy, lethal. "Because, Mr. Gallagher, I have a copy of the fourth-floor security camera footage from that exact date and time, and it tells a very different story." Liam's condescending smile froze. It didn't disappear, but it became brittle like old plastic. His eyes darted to the USB drive, then to Miller. Miller jumped out of his chair. "Objection, Your Honor, the state has not been provided with any video evidence in discovery. This is a blatant ambush. Furthermore, Horizon Tech informed the police that the cameras on the 4th floor were non-operational on that date. They lied to the police," I said, looking directly at Miller. I turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I am not introducing this video as direct evidence. I am introducing it as impeachment evidence to directly contradict the witness's sworn testimony under penalty of perjury. Rule 608 allows for extrinsic evidence to impeach a witness's character for truthfulness when they lie on the stand. It was a gamble, a massive procedural gamble. I had spent 6 hours in the law library last night piecing together this specific loophole." Judge Harrison looked at me, genuine surprise flickering in her tired eyes. She looked at Miller, who was suddenly very red in the face, and then at Liam, who was gripping the arms of the witness chair so tightly his knuckles were white. "Approach the bench," Judge Harrison commanded. The carpet near the bench was worn down to the threading. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Adia Miller. He smelled like cheap peppermint mints and stale coffee. "Ms. Davis," Judge Harrison whispered harshly, leaning over the high wooden barrier. "Where did you get this footage?" "An internal whistleblower at Horizon Tech, Your Honor." I lied smoothly. "The company attempted to suppress it because it implicates a senior manager. But the footage clearly shows Mr. Gallagher accessing my terminal at the exact minute the funds were transferred." Miller scoffed a wet, angry sound. "Your Honor, chain of custody. We have no idea if this video is doctored. A pro se defendant pulling a magic USB drive out of her pocket? It's absurd." Judge Harrison stared at me. Her gaze was piercing, peeling back my layers. I didn't flinch. I kept my breathing shallow, steady. I let the desperation and the absolute certainty of my innocence burn in my eyes. "Mr. Miller," the judge said slowly, "if this video shows what she says, it shows your star witness just committed perjury in my courtroom. And your office failed to properly execute a subpoena for the building's server data, taking a corporate PR rep's word that cameras were broken. I am going to view this footage in camera, right now, in my chambers." She banged her gavel once. "We are in recess for 15 minutes. The 15 minutes felt like 15 years. I sat back at the defense table. I didn't look at Liam. I didn't need to. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing from the witness box. He hadn't moved. The squeak of his expensive leather shoes was completely absent. When Judge Harrison returned, the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange, dark electricity. She sat down. She didn't look at Miller. She didn't look at me. She locked eyes with Liam Gallagher. "Mr. Gallagher," Judge Harrison said. Her voice was no longer dry. It was cold, absolute zero. "I am reminding you that you are under oath. I will ask you one more time. Did you at 1:24 p.m. on October 12th leave the 3rd floor walk to Ms. Davis's cubicle and use her terminal?" Liam opened his mouth. A pathetic, breathy sound came out. He looked at Miller silently, begging for a lifeline. Miller, realizing his entire case was disintegrating, stared intensely at his legal pad. I might have gone up to check an email," Liam stammered. The smooth, arrogant manager was gone. He was just a sweating, panicked man in a very expensive suit. "To check an email? On your intern's computer?" The judge summarized flatly. "While she was out fetching your dry cleaning?" "Yes." Judge Harrison picked up her gavel. "Mr. Miller, the state's case relies entirely on the credibility of this witness and the integrity of the digital logs he oversaw. The court finds this witness utterly devoid of credibility. The prosecution's evidence is irrevocably tainted. Miller stood up slowly. He looked defeated. The state moves to dismiss the charges, Your Honor, without prejudice. Denied, Judge Harrison snapped. Dismissed with prejudice? This young woman will not be dragged back into this courtroom for this matter ever again. She turned her sharp gaze to me. For a second, just a split second, the harsh lines around her mouth softened. Ms. Davis, you are free to go. She turned back to Miller. And Mr. Miller, I suggest you contact the fraud division. I believe you have a new suspect for your embezzlement case. Court is adjourned. Crack. The gavel hit the sounding block. It was the exact same sound that had ended my life yesterday. Today, it restarted it. I didn't cry. I didn't leap into the air. I calmly packed my legal pad and the USB drive, which the judge had returned, into my cheap canvas tote bag. My hands were perfectly steady. As I walked down the center aisle, Liam was arguing fiercely with Miller near the prosecution table. I didn't stop to gloat. He was already a ghost to me. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed, but it didn't sound like a mosquito anymore. It just sounded like electricity. I pulled out my phone. The cracked screen lit up. 11:45 a.m. Chloe's showcase wasn't over. In fact, the regional broadcast was scheduled to start at noon. A cold, hollow sensation settled in my stomach. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind the bruised, raw reality of my existence. I had saved myself, but I was still the daughter of parents who hadn't even bothered to text me to ask if I was going to prison today. I walked out of the courthouse. The weather was painfully beautiful. Crisp blue sky, a biting autumn wind that smelled of dried leaves and exhaust fumes. I got into my beaten-up Honda. The engine whined, then caught. I pulled out into traffic heading west toward the stadium. I wasn't going there to seek their approval. I wasn't going to beg for a hug. I was going to sever the cord. The municipal stadium was a concrete monstrosity usually reserved for minor league hockey. Today it was plastered with neon pink banners that read, "Starlight Idol, the search for the soul." Parking was a nightmare. I abandoned the Honda in a loading zone next to a row of dumpsters, tossing a crumpled $20 bill onto the dashboard in a futile attempt to ward off a tow truck. I didn't care if they took the car. I felt completely detached from physical possessions. I walked toward the side entrance. The air here was thick-smelling aggressively of burnt sugar from a nearby funnel cake stand, cheap aerosol hairspray, and the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat. 2 bored security guards in yellow windbreakers guarded the backstage access doors. "Pass!" One of them grunted, barely looking up from his phone. "I'm Chloe Davis's manager." I lied, my voice flat and authoritative. I didn't even slow my pace. I just projected the absolute confidence of someone who belonged there. "She needs her throat coat tea before she goes on. Move." He blinked, intimidated by the sharp blazer and the sheer coldness in my eyes, and stepped aside. The backstage area was a chaotic, vibrating labyrinth of temporary partitions, black curtains, and exposed wiring. Teenagers and young adults in varying states of sequined undress paced frantically, practicing vocal runs that clashed into a terrible atonal symphony. I navigated the maze, following the scent of vanilla body spray. I found them near the curtain opening to the main stage. Beatrice was aggressively powdering Chloe's nose, her own face tight with vicarious anxiety. Arthur was holding a plastic water bottle with a long straw, murmuring encouraging platitudes. Chloe looked radiant. The sapphire blue dress caught the harsh backstage lights perfectly. She looked exactly like the star they wanted her to be. "And remember, when you hit the high C, look directly into the camera on crane 2. Arthur was saying. "Project the emotions, sweetie. You own this." I stopped 10 feet away. I just stood there watching them, A perfect, self-contained unit. A family. For a moment, a deeply pathetic, childish part of my heart fractured. A small voice inside me screamed, "Look at me. I fought a dragon today and won. Tell me you're proud of me." I ruthlessly suffocated that voice. I swallowed the lump in my throat. It tasted like ash. "Cute dress," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the backstage noise like a scalpel. All three of them whipped their heads around. Beatrice gasped, dropping the powder puff onto the dirty concrete floor. "Audrey, what are you doing here?" Arthur frowned, quickly checking his watch. "Audrey, we told you we can't do lunch until after." "The trial's over," I interrupted. I didn't move closer. I kept my distance. Chloe blinked, her heavy false eyelashes fluttering like clumsy moths. "Over. It's only noon. Did you take the plea deal already? I told you it would be fine." "No," I said quietly. "I fired Greg. I represented myself. I found the security footage Horizon Tech hid, and I proved Liam framed me. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice. Liam is being investigated for felony fraud." Silence crashed over our little section of the hallway. The frantic vocal warm-ups around us seemed to fade into white noise. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed. She looked from me to Arthur and back to me. You went to trial by yourself." "Yes." "But, Audrey, that's incredibly dangerous." Arthur said, his voice rising in sudden, misplaced paternal outrage. "Why didn't you tell us you could have gone to jail?" I let out a short, hollow laugh. It scraped against my ribs. "I did tell you. Yesterday morning, in the kitchen, while you were steaming a velvet shawl." "Well, you didn't say you were firing your lawyer." Beatrice defended her hands, fluttering nervously around her throat. "We thought it was just a procedural thing today. You know how important this showcase is to your sister." "I know exactly how important it is," I said, my gaze shifting to Chloe. She was staring at me, a strange mix of guilt and profound annoyance on her perfectly contoured face. I had interrupted her headspace. I was stealing her spotlight. "Odds, I'm glad you're not going to jail," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I really am, but I go on in literally 4 minutes. Can we celebrate this tonight?" "We're not celebrating tonight, Chloe," I said. I finally stepped closer. Just one step. "I didn't come here to celebrate. I came here to look at you. All of you." I looked at my father, who was suddenly avoiding my eyes. I looked at my mother, who was nervously picking at a loose thread on her sweater. "I faced a judge today," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing them to lean in to hear the venom. "I faced a man who tried to destroy my life and a prosecutor who wanted to lock me in a cage. And the most terrifying part wasn't the law. It wasn't the threat of prison." I paused. I let the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. The most terrifying part," I continued, staring dead into my mother's eyes, "was turning around and looking at the empty benches in the gallery, knowing that my own parents decided a regional talent show was more important than my freedom." "Audrey, that's not fair." Beatrice whispered, tears suddenly welling in her eyes. It was a reflex. Whenever she felt cornered, she cried. "You're making us sound like monsters." You're not monsters, Mom," I said flatly. "Monsters are deliberate. You're just shallow. You chose the shiny thing over the broken thing. It's human nature, I guess." "Now listen here, young lady." Arthur started, his face reddening. "No, you listen," I snapped. The sudden spike in my volume made him physically flinch. "I am 22 years old. Today I saved my own life. I did it completely alone. And I realized something very important in that courtroom. Contestant number 4. Chloe Davis, Places. A stagehand barked through a megaphone down the hall. Chloe jumped. Panic flooded her features. "Mom, Dad, I have to go." "Go?" I told her, my voice eerily calm again. "Go sing your song, Chloe, because I'm done playing the audience." I looked back at my parents. "I'm moving out by the end of the weekend. I don't want your dinner. I don't want your apologies. You didn't show up for me when I was drowning. You don't get to stand next to me now that I've built my own boat." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't wait for Beatrice to fully start crying or for Arthur to muster a defense. I turned my back on them. As I walked away, I heard the heavy velvet curtain pull back. I heard the roar of the crowd, a massive, faceless beast demanding entertainment. And then I heard Chloe's voice slightly sharp and trembling, missing the first note entirely. I pushed through the exit doors, stepping back out into the sharp, biting autumn air. I took a deep breath. My lungs filled completely. There was no pain, no blood, just air. My life as their daughter was over. But my life as Audrey Davis, that had just begun. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. Years bleed together when you measure them in billable hours and fluorescent lighting. Law school wasn't the glamorous montage they show in movies. It was the smell of dry erase markers, stale drip coffee, and the panic sweat of 100 overachievers crammed into a poorly ventilated library. I lived on a diet of cheap instant ramen and spite. Spite is a fantastic fuel source. It burns clean, leaves no residue, and never runs out. I didn't speak to my parents. The first year they tried. Beatrice would leave voicemails that smelled of weaponized guilt, crying about how much Chloe missed me, how they had an extra ticket to her opening night at a community theater production in Los Angeles. I never called back. By the second year, the calls stopped. By the third year, I had changed my number. I kept tabs, though. It's a toxic habit watching the people who broke you, but I was human. Chloe had placed 4th on Starlight Idol. It was enough to give her a bloated sense of importance, but not enough to secure a major label contract. She moved to California. Arthur and Beatrice co-signed the lease on her overpriced West Hollywood apartment. They remortgaged the house on Elm Street to pay for her vocal coaches, her headshots, her PR team, which consisted of a fast-talking guy named Gary, who took 15% of nothing. While Chloe was auditioning for toothpaste commercials, I was interning at the district attorney's office. I learned how to look at a trembling defendant and strip away the performance. I learned the precise texture of a lie. It's gritty. It catches in the throat. People who are lying always talk too much, trying to fill the dead air with unnecessary details. I never filled the dead air. I let the silence stretch until it suffocated them. I graduated top of my class. My graduation ceremony was held on a blistering day in May. I wore a heavy black gown that trapped the heat against my skin. When I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I looked out at the folding chairs on the lawn. I had invited an older mentor, a cynical former prosecutor named David, who clapped loudly from the back row. But the seats meant for my family empty. It didn't hurt. Not anymore. The space where that ache used to live had calcified. It was hard, smooth bone now. I spent 6 years in the trenches as an ADA. I prosecuted white-collar crime. I dragged men like Liam Gallagher out of their corner offices and watched them squirm on the stand. I built a reputation. I was fair, I was meticulous, and I was utterly merciless. The defense attorneys called me the icebox. I took it as a compliment. By the time I was 31, a vacancy opened up on the state district court. It was a political knife fight. But I had the conviction record, the backing of the local bar association, and an absolutely spotless personal life. I had no messy family drama leaking into the tabloids. I was a ghost who only existed to work. The governor appointed me in late October. Putting on the judicial robe for the first time is a profoundly strange physical sensation. It's heavy. The black wool blend drags at your shoulders, forcing you to stand straighter. It smells faintly of dry cleaning fluid and starch. It isn't just a piece of clothing, it's an erasure of the self. When you zip it up to the collar, you stop being Audrey Davis. You become the state. You become the final word. My chambers were located on the 6th floor of the new municipal courthouse. The room smelled of lemon polish and old leather bindings. I had a heavy mahogany desk, a view of the gray city skyline, and a clerk named Sarah, who was terrifyingly efficient and entirely devoid of a sense of humor. I liked her immensely. "Judge Davis," Sarah said, stepping into my chambers on a rainy Tuesday morning. She held a manila folder, her expression carefully neutral. "We have a slight issue with the afternoon civil docket." I didn't look up from the motion I was reading. The paper was thin, the ink slightly smeared. "Define slight, Sarah." Case 402-B, Sterling Productions versus Chloe Davis. Breach of contract fraud and misappropriation of funds. My pen stopped. A drop of black ink pooled on the legal pad, bleeding into the yellow paper. I slowly lifted my head. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly still. "Chloe Davis," I repeated. The name tasted foreign in my mouth. A dusty artifact pulled from a forgotten box. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said. She knew my background check. She knew who my family was, even if the general public didn't make the connection. "The defendant is your sister. She's being sued by a reality television production company. They allege she took a $60,000 advance for a documentary series about her life, then failed to show up for filming using the funds to pay off personal credit card debt. $60,000. It was poetic, really. 10 years ago, my manager framed me for $40,000, and my parents told me to plead guilty because it was a stupid mistake. Now their golden child was on the hook for grand theft by deception. The plaintiff is requesting an emergency asset freeze." Sarah continued, her voice perfectly even. "They claim she's a flight risk. I assume you want me to file the recusal paperwork immediately. Ethically, I had to recuse. I could not preside over my sister's case. It was a glaring conflict of interest." "Yes," I said softly, staring out the window at the relentless gray rain. "Draft the recusal. Reassign it to Judge Miller." Miller was the former ADA who had tried to prosecute me 10 years ago. He was a judge now, too. He was brutal on fraud cases. The irony was almost too rich a suffocating dessert. "However," I said, turning my chair back to the desk. "Before the docket is officially transferred, schedule a mandatory preliminary conference in my chambers. 1 o'clock. Tell the defense counsel their client must be present and her financial guarantors." Sarah's pen paused. "Her guarantors?" "Her parents co-signed the production contract." I guessed. I knew Arthur and Beatrice. They couldn't help themselves. They would sign their souls away to keep Chloe's name in print. Sarah checked the file. "Yes, Your Honor. Arthur and Beatrice Davis are listed as co-defendants. Have them all here at 1. I need to formally verify the conflict of interest on the record before I step down." It was a flimsy bureaucratic excuse, but I was the judge. I made the rules in this building. At 12:55 p.m., I zipped up my robe. The zipper made a sharp, metallic, raspy sound in the quiet room. I poured myself a glass of water from the silver carafe on my desk. The water was ice cold. It numbed my throat. At exactly 1 p.m., Sarah opened the heavy oak door. "The defendants are here, Your Honor." They walked in. Time is a cruel, relentless sculptor. It chips away at everything. Beatrice entered first. The impeccably styled hair was gone, replaced by a cheap brassy blonde dye job that showed gray at the roots. She looked small, her shoulders hunched inside a beige raincoat that smelled sharply of mothballs and stale cigarettes. Arthur followed. He looked exhausted. The aggressive, confident father who had steamed velvet shawls like a weapon was gone. His face was deeply lined, his posture defeated. And then came Chloe. She wore a pair of oversized designer sunglasses indoors, a desperate attempt to hide the puffiness around her eyes. She smelled strongly of a generic sweet perfume, trying to mask the unmistakable sour tang of day-old alcohol. The sapphire blue dress days were long gone. She wore faded jeans and a black sweater. She looked exactly like what she was, a 30-year-old woman who had never been told no, finally hitting the concrete bottom of reality. They didn't recognize me at first. The heavy desk, the high-backed leather chair, the black robe, it was an intimidating tableau. They approached like frightened animals. "Sit," I commanded. My voice bounced off the wood-paneled walls. Beatrice flinched. She looked up, her eyes squinting through her thick bifocals. Her breath caught. A wet, choking sound escaped her throat. "Audrey," she whispered. Arthur's head snapped up. He gripped the back of the leather guest chair, his knuckles turning white. "Audrey, good God. You're the judge." Chloe pulled her sunglasses down to the bridge of her nose. Her mouth hung open. "Judge Davis." I corrected, my voice stripped of any warmth. "You will address me as Your Honor." The silence in the chambers was absolute. I could hear the faint, erratic ticking of Arthur's cheap wristwatch. Beatrice began to cry. It wasn't the manipulative, theatrical crying she used to employ. It was a broken, ugly sound. Tears spilled over her wrinkled cheeks, cutting tracks through her foundation. "Oh, Audrey," she sobbed, taking a step toward the desk. "My baby, we didn't know. We've been trying to find you for years. Look at you. You're so beautiful. You're a judge." She reached out a trembling hand. "Step back from the desk, Mrs. Davis," I said. It wasn't a request. The temperature in the room plummeted. Beatrice froze her hand, hovering in the air. She pulled it back, clutching it to her chest as if she had been burned. Arthur cleared his throat. He tried to puff out his chest, falling back on the old paternal authority that no longer existed. "Audrey, please. We're family. We're in a terrible bind here. This whole lawsuit is a misunderstanding. Chloe just got overwhelmed with the production schedule. If you could just dismiss this or talk to the producers." "Are you asking me to commit judicial misconduct, Mr. Davis?" I asked, leaning forward, resting my forearms on the desk. "Are you asking me to corrupt my court to cover your daughter's theft?" "Theft?" Chloe suddenly shrieked, her voice shrill and grating. "It wasn't theft. It was an advance. I have a brand to maintain. They were exploiting me. Odds, you have to help me. I'll go to jail." "Like I almost did?" I asked. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a guillotine blade. Chloe's mouth snapped shut. Arthur looked at the floor. Beatrice just kept crying into a crumpled tissue. 10 years ago," I said, my voice eerily calm, "I was 22 years old, facing a felony conviction for a crime I didn't commit. I was terrified. I begged you for help. And you told me to take a plea deal, so I wouldn't ruin the morning of a regional talent show." "We were wrong," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "We were so wrong, Audrey. We bet on the wrong horse. We lost everything. The house on Elm Street. It's gone. The bank took it. We're living in a one-bedroom apartment in the valley. Please, we have nothing left." "We bet on the wrong horse. Not we failed our daughter. Not we were cruel and neglectful. They just made a bad investment. That was the tragedy to them." I looked at Chloe, the reality TV star, the girl who communicated in show tunes and passive aggression. She was staring at me with a mixture of terror and deep, poisonous envy. "I am officially recusing myself from this case," I stated, picking up my pen. The scratching sound filled the room as I signed the bottom of the document. A judge cannot preside over a case involving an immediate relative. It is a violation of the Judicial Code of Conduct. "No," Chloe panicked, lunging forward, slapping her hands flat on my mahogany desk. "Audrey, no, you can't leave me to some stranger. You have to fix this." I didn't flinch. I just looked down at her hands on my desk. "Remove your hands from my desk, Miss Davis," I said quietly. She hesitated, then snatched them back. "Your case is being reassigned to Judge Miller." I continued smoothly. "You might remember him. He was the prosecutor who tried to lock me up a decade ago. He has a zero-tolerance policy for white-collar fraud. He routinely hands out maximum sentences for misappropriation of funds." Arthur groaned, burying his face in his hands. Beatrice looked at me, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "Audrey, you're throwing her to the wolves. You're doing this on purpose. You're punishing us." "I am executing the law," I corrected. "I am stepping away from a conflict of interest. What happens in Judge Miller's courtroom is entirely based on the evidence of Chloe's actions. If she is innocent, the evidence will exonerate her. That's how the justice system works. Isn't that what you told me 10 years ago?" I stood up. The black robe billowed slightly, a dark cloud settling around me. I towered over them. "You spent your entire lives curating a performance," I said, looking at the three of them. "You prioritized the applause over reality. You wanted a star, and you got one. A failing, fraudulent star that burned down your entire life." I walked around the desk. They instinctively backed up, parting to let me through. "I didn't win a talent show," I said, softly, pausing next to Chloe. She smelled intensely of cheap vanilla and fear. "I fought a war, and I survived. You have no part in my victory." I walked to the heavy oak door and opened it. Sarah was standing right outside, her clipboard clutched to her chest. "Sarah," I said, my voice echoing down the marble hallway. "Please escort the defendants to courtroom 4A. Judge Miller is waiting." Beatrice let out a tragic, wailing sob. Arthur reached out his hand, brushing the sleeve of my robe. "Audrey, please, isn't there any love left? We're your family." I looked at his wrinkled hand, then up into his desperate, tired eyes. "Court is adjourned, Arthur," I said. I stepped back into my chambers and shut the heavy oak door. The latch clicked a solid, final sound. The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was full. It was the sound of peace. I walked back to my desk, sat down in the leather chair, and opened the next file on my docket. I didn't look out the window to watch them leave. I had a city to serve, a life to live, and I was finally wonderfully, completely alone. The truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet click of a closing door. Audrey survived the betrayal that should have broken her, trading the fragile illusion of family for the unyielding armor of justice. She didn't just survive the fire, she became the gavel that strikes the anvil. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family to save yourself? Drop your story in the comments below. If Audrey's cold, calculated revenge satisfied your soul, smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their worth, and subscribe for more raw, relentless drama.